Alrighty. Father God, we thank you for being able to come here tonight and for your love, care, and protection over us. I just ask that you would, excuse me, that you would help us to be able to understand more about the founding of our country. I think we're going to be talking about the Constitution and things today, and real truth about the Constitution. So we also thank you for the opportunity we have to lift these to you in prayer and pray for Betty Bolts tomorrow. Just ask you to lift her up and give her comfort. We thank you for partners who are going to be able to start the adoption process, answers to prayer there, and we pray for the red tape and all the other stuff that gets involved in these kind of things, and that you would iron out all of those, different things that has to be done to everything to be done right time, so that it can be a smooth process as possible. And we pray for Jesse tomorrow as he's going to be leading the Bible study at work. We thank you for the fruit that has been harvested already from other Bible studies in the past that he has done this recent year. And I pray that it will continue, and for those who will be harvested in the near future because of the ways in which you use these Bible studies. So now as we get ready to watch our videos, we just thank you for your love, mercy, and grace, and ask you in Jesus' name. We're not going to have any discussion, so I really don't need to wear it. Nobody talks.
Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
Separation of church and state has become one of the best known phrases in American history, and it's a phrase that's been completely turned on its head from what its original intent was. When you look at separation of church and state, that was not a phrase that came from secularists trying to keep Christians out of the public arena. It was a phrase that came out of the Reformation trying to keep the government out of the church.
Now, you said some pretty interesting thing that I've never heard before, that the Reformation, okay, that period of time was really based upon that issue. We always thought that Protestantism was coming away from Catholicism, and that created the Protestant church. But you're saying that really the Reformation was really to get the affairs of the state out of the affairs of the church.
Exactly. The Reformation was not a Catholic Protestant thing at all, because the Reformation was saying, hey, wait a minute, we're doing these practices, here's what the Bible teaches, let's go back to what the Bible teaches.
Got it.
Now, eventually, after 2 centuries of that, the Protestant church was birthed, but that was never the design, that was never the intent.
Wow. These
These guys were loyal Catholic priests who were just saying, we need to go back to the Bible. Now, you had Henry VIII who birthed the Protestant with the Anglican church because he wanted to be in charge of something. So he wanted his own church to be in charge of, so he birthed it. And then you had Anglicans saying, wait a minute, we're not doing this right. Here's what the Bible teaches. And it's the Bible that teaches separation of church and state. But it's an institutional separation, not an influential separation.
Got it.
You see, the first time you find the phrase is in England in the 1500s with a theologian, Richard Hooker. And he's the one who first used the phrase separation of church and state. Then as you come into American history, you find the first use of the phrase separation of church and state is by the minister, Christian minister, Roger Williams. It's the same thing. He's trying to get the government to leave the church alone.
We so often hear the Constitution's religion clauses in the First Amendment coupled with the phrase separation of church and state. Yet concerning religion, the First Amendment only states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Clearly, neither the word separation, nor church, nor state is found in any part of the First Amendment. In fact, that phrase appears in no governmental founding document. Of course, most today recognize the phrase separation of church and state, but few know its source. Yet it is important to understand the origins of that phrase and how it subsequently became somehow attached to the First Amendment. The debate surrounding the framing of the First Amendment ran from June the 7th through September the 25th of 1789, and the records of those debates make unequivocally clear that the First Amendment's purpose was to limit the federal government in two specific areas. First, the federal government was prohibited from establishing a national denomination, whether Catholic, Anglican, or any other. This was the very problem that America had faced when she was part of Great Britain. The founders did not want that in America. The part of the First Amendment that forbids any such national denomination is called the Establishment Clause, and it is the part stating, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Secondly, the First Amendment also prohibited the federal government from interfering with or limiting the people's religious expressions. This part of the First Amendment is called the Free Exercise Clause. It's the part stating or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
So what is the source of Jefferson's now infamous phrase? On November the 7th, 1801, the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut wrote Jefferson concerned that the guarantee of the free exercise of religion appeared in the First Amendment. To them, this suggested that the right to religious exercise was a government-granted rather than a God-granted right, thus implying that someday the government might try to regulate religious expression. They believed that freedom of religion was a God-granted, unalienable right, and that the government should be powerless to restrict religious activities unless, as the Baptists explained, those activities cause someone to, quote, work ill to his neighbor.
Jefferson understood their concern, for he had already proven that it was his concern as well. He replied to the Danbury Baptists on January the 1st, 1802, thanking them for their kind prayers and assuring them that their free exercise of religion was indeed an inalienable right and therefore would not be meddled with by the government. Jefferson pointed out to them that there was, quote, a wall of separation between church and state, and that this wall of separation would prevent the government from interfering with or hindering religious activities.
In modern politics, the term separation of church and state is most commonly used to ban acts of faith in the public arena. But a closer look into history reveals the intentions of this phrase to be just the opposite. How then has our history been redefined and rewritten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Modern day now, we believe separation of church and state is to keep the church under control,
Right.
And so that the state, and state affairs, you cannot have religious activities into the affairs of state and school and that kind of stuff. So you're talking about a 180
Complete reversal. See, what's happened today is separation of church and state has become the great club of secularism to beat people of faith back in the corner. Oh, you're trying to pray. Get back in the corner. Separation of church. So it's used to stop religious expressions.
That's certainly, Dave, how I understand it.
And that's the way it has been in the last 50 years.
Okay.
What it had been for the first 450 years was to get the government to leave religious expression alone. It's not their business to regulate religious expression. It's not their business to tell you how, when, or where you can pray or what you can say when you do pray. It's not their business to tell you what religious beliefs you're going to have. That was separation of church and state. And the way that phrase came about was a group of Baptist ministers wrote to Thomas Jefferson, who was president. And Jefferson was a sympathetic ear. I mean, he agreed with them totally. And they said, look, we as Baptists have been the subjects of persecution in America because we were preaching without an Anglican license, and they're not supposed to be doing that. I mean, that's not separate. We want separation of church and state. We want the government to leave us alone, stay out of what we do. And so they wrote to Jefferson with that concern. They said, we're really concerned about this First Amendment to the Constitution. I mean, this First Amendment says that Congress can't make any law respecting the establishment of religion. There shouldn't be anything in the Constitution saying what government can or can't do with religion because it's not their domain.
Right.
So their concern is that having government mentioned in the First Amendment, the government someday might think that it had the right to regulate religious expression. We would say, hey, First Amendment's a protection for us. They were saying, no, First Amendment opens the door for government to come get involved with religious activities. And the First Amendment's a problem. That was their view. So Jefferson writes them back and said, look, you don't have to worry. He assured them the government's not going to stop their religious activities because we have a wall of separation. Now, that's really key because his whole wall of separation is to reassure them that the government's not going to mess with any of their religious activities. You're not going to have to worry about the government stopping religious expression. It's not going to do it. See, that was the design. Now we use separation of church and state to stop religious expression.
In fact, for almost a century and a half after Jefferson's letter, there was no misunderstanding either about the purpose of the First Amendment or the meaning of Jefferson's phrase. Here's an example. In 1853, half a century after Jefferson had written that phrase, a group petitioned Congress urging them to separate Christian principles from government, with chaplains being turned out of Congress and the military, and Christian principles being removed from government in the official public square. They desired the so-called separation of church and state, but in the wrong direction. That is, instead of the government protecting religious expressions in the public arena because of separation, they wanted the government to remove religious expressions. Congress spent a year investigating that possibility and then emphatically rejected it, declaring, had the people, the Founding Fathers, during the Revolution had any suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and its amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, but not any one sect, denomination. The report continued. It said, in this age, there is no substitute for Christianity. That was the religion of the founders of the Republic, and they expected it to remain the religion of their descendants. 2 months later, the Judiciary Committee made this strong declaration. It said, the great, vital, and conservative element in our system, the thing that holds our system together, is the belief of our people in the pure doctrines and the divine truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That was Congress. Congress clearly refused to separate Christian principles from the public arena. However, it was not just Congress that refused to do so. The Supreme Court refused to do so as well. In an 1878 case, more than 3/4 of a century after Jefferson had penned a separation letter, the plaintiffs in that case invoked his separation of church and state phrase, hoping to use it to their advantage. However, that Supreme Court was not content to let them get by with just using the 8-word separation phrase out of context from Jefferson's letter, which, by the way, is what courts today do. No, rather than just cite the single phrase, the Supreme Court reprinted a lengthy segment from Jefferson's letter to prove that separation of church and state was intended to protect rather than remove Christian values and practices from public policy.
In one way, you've clarified something and made it very simple. In another way, you have made it a little more complex for me. Let me tell you why. I didn't know that the Bible teaches separation of church and state. I would have said, let's take the phrase separation of church and state and trash it completely. But that's not what you're saying.
No.
We need it, but we just need it applied differently.
We need it applied in a scriptural way.
Okay.
If you take the example of King Uzziah. King Uzziah was a great king of Israel. He feared God, he loved God, he honored God in his administration. His people prospered. He was a great military leader. The Bible tells us that God gave him inventions of war. Well, he had done so well, God had prospered him so much, he decides he's going to go in the temple and offer sacrifices. So he goes to the temple and the priests say, time out. You're not a priest. You're a king. We're the priest. We offer sacrifices. You're not supposed to be in here offering sacrifices. He said, I'm the king. I'm going to act like a priest too. And they said, don't do it. He started to do it. He started to offer the sacrifice incense, and God struck him with leprosy. He went out of the temple. He eventually died of that leprosy. God weighed in on it. He said, you're the king, you're not the priest. That's a separation of church and state. That's an institutional separation. The king is not the priest. Now, you also have examples of the Bible where, and particularly in Genesis, you see that God ordains 3 institutions. He creates first the institution of family, puts man and woman together, said this is good, that's family. Next, we have the institution of civil government, where he says, here's how I want you to conduct your horizontal relationships. And he says, all right, whoever sheds man's blood, by him will man's blood be shed. So we start getting these civil laws for murder and behavior and theft, etc. And then by the end of Genesis, he says, now here's how I want your vertical relationship conducted. We would call that the church. So those 3 institutions, you got family, you have government, and you have church. As you look across the scriptures, God gives certain directives to one institution that he never gives to the other institutions. For example, you get to Romans 13, God gives the sword to civil government. He never gives the sword to church. The church is not to bear the sword. If the church picks the sword up, the sword of civil justice, they violated the institutional separations. And that's what happened in that middle time of Christianity, where the church started picking up the sword and saying, you're not believing right, we're going to kill you. Well, that's what happened when church and state merged, was the sword got in the hands of the church, and that's where atrocities come from throughout history. The Inquisition, Crusades, whatever you would point to, it's when the church took the sword in his hand. So there's very clear institutional differences that God gives in the Bible. And those institutions are supposed to stay right where God put them, not supposed to cross into the other. And that's what the Reformers taught. As wait a minute, guys, we're not supposed to have these two institutions merged. That the sword stays over here, the kings are over here, the priests are over here. And that's the way it's supposed to be. And so in America, that's what it was.
In modern politics, the term separation of church and state is most commonly used to ban acts of faith in the public arena. But a closer look into history reveals the intentions of this phrase to be just the opposite. How then has our history been redefined and rewritten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
In the case Everson versus Board of Education, the court cited only Jefferson's separation metaphor, ignoring the rest of his letter and its clear context. It therefore boldly announced a new policy. The First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. This was a brand new philosophy for the court. No longer would Jefferson's separation phrase protect public religious expressions, as it had for the previous century and a half. It would now become a mandate to exclude religious expressions and to secularize the public square. Significantly, as courts and secularists began to remove public religious expressions, they simultaneously clamored separation of church and state, claiming this is what the founders wanted. This was their great intent. So often have they repeated the separation phrase when talking about the First Amendment that many citizens today now believe that the phrase is actually part of the First Amendment, thus demonstrating the truth of the statement attributed to Dr. William James, the father of modern psychology. There is nothing so absurd, but if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it. The Supreme Court, having announced its new approach in 1947, first nationally implemented the policy of public secularism in 1962 when, for the first time in American history, it ordered the separation of religious principles from education, ruling that it was unconstitutional for a student to pray voluntarily, to say a voluntary prayer at school. The court achieved its reversal of the Constitution's protection for religious expressions first by using the phrase separation of church and state without regard to its historical meaning, and then by redefining the meaning of a single word within the separation phrase, the word church. For nearly 2 centuries prior to that case, the word church in the phrase separation of church and state was defined to mean a federally established national denomination, such as was represented by the Baptists or Catholics or Anglicans or Presbyterians or whatever. However, in 1962, the court decided that the word church would no longer mean a religious institution, it would now mean a religious activity. So, instead of the First Amendment being used to prevent the federal government from setting up a national denomination, which voluntary prayer certainly did not do, it now meant that the federal government must not allow a public religious activity, which voluntary prayer certainly was.
Jefferson very wisely attached separation of church and state to what we call the free exercise clause.
Wow.
Now, the First Amendment of the Constitution doesn't have anything to say about separation of church and state. As a matter of fact, here's a really fun thing that we don't hear much about. We're told today that this is one of the great intents of the Founding Fathers, is separation of church and state. Well, first off, Thomas Jefferson was not a framer of the First Amendment. He was not even in America when the First Amendment was framed. He was overseas in Europe. He had no part in framing it. As a matter of fact, a biography that was written by Joseph Priestley about Thomas Jefferson tried to link Jefferson to the First Amendment of the Constitution. And Jefferson wrote back his friend and said, no, you got to take me out of that section. I had nothing to do with the Constitution. I had nothing to do with the Bill of Rights. I was not in America when it was done. I was not a participant. I had one letter sent to me about what was going to be in it, and that's all. I never even saw it until I got back to America. So we've made a guy who had no role in the First Amendment to be the chief spokesman on it. Now, what we've got is we have 90 Founding Fathers who did frame the First Amendment. All of their debates, from start to finish, are in the records of Congress. From June the 19th or 20th of 1789 to about September the 24th and 25th of 1789. So you have these guys for several months, 90 guys going after the language of the First Amendment. Here's what we'll permit, here's what we won't permit. All the records of Congress are there. Not one single one of those 90 founding fathers ever even mentioned the phrase separation of church and state when they're framing the First Amendment. They didn't even talk about it. Now, it seemed like if that was their intent for the First Amendment, somebody would have said something about it.
Right.
The phrase is not mentioned one time. It's mentioned in a letter that comes later by Thomas Jefferson.
That had nothing to do with the framing of it.
All that letter had to do was to reassure them the government's not going to interfere with their religious expression. And so he uses a metaphor that is well known to those people. Baptists have had it, Christians have had it. Any Reformation-minded person understands separation of church and state means keep the institutions apart. Don't let the government stop our religious expressions. Keep it apart. And now we've turned it completely on its head. You see, what's happened today is if we really believed separation of church and state, then we wouldn't allow the state to have zoning or building codes that affect the church. We wouldn't allow the state to have any kind of influence over health codes in the church or employment codes of the church or tax codes of the church. We'd say separation of church and state, you can't touch the church at all if we really believe separation of church and state. But what's happened is separation of church and state means, oh, you religious people can't get involved in the public arena. Reversal from what it's supposed to be.
The Constitution mandates in Article 1, Section 5, Paragraph 3, that written records be kept of what goes on in Congress. The founders required this because they wanted government open, accessible, and accountable to the people. Within the congressional records, you or I at any time can read what our elected officials are doing and saying, or not doing and not saying, and then hold them accountable. Every debate and every vote which has taken place in Congress from 1774 to the present is recorded in these public records. And it is because of these records that we know exactly what happened when Congress moved into this building. According to the records for late November of 1800, Congress spent the first few weeks organizing the rooms, the committees, their locations, etc. And then, in the first week of December 1800, Congress made an interesting decision. What was that decision? Congress decided that the Capitol building would also serve as a church building. The U.S. Capitol, this building, became a church. The use of this building as a church building is confirmed not only by the records of Congress, but also by the diaries of those who served in Congress at the time. For example, when John Quincy Adams was a U.S. Senator in 1803, he recorded in his diary for October the 30th, attended public service at the Capitol, where Mr. Ratoon, an Episcopalian clergyman from Baltimore, preached a sermon. The week before, he had written, religious service is usually performed on Sundays at the Treasury office and at the Capitol. I went both forenoon and afternoon to the Treasury. Very few realize that this building, as well as other government buildings, served as church buildings, but indeed such was the case.
In modern politics, the term separation of church and state is most commonly used to ban acts of faith in the public arena. But a closer look into history reveals the intentions of this phrase to be just the opposite. How then has our history been redefined and rewritten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Dave, what I think you have just done is given me information about what I thought I knew about the term separation of church and state, and spun the term separation of church and state literally 180 degrees from the original intent of its framers.
Or it was you stay out of our affairs. Get out of our affairs.
Let me show you how corrupt the interpretation has become. Because the First Amendment of the Constitution is very simple. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And if we don't understand that, we go to the records of Congress. That means Congress cannot establish a federal denomination. They can't make us all Baptists, Presbyterians, or anything else. And Congress can't do anything to impede religious expression. That was their goal. You stay out of regulating people's religious expressions, and you don't set up a federal church. Now, that's what it meant. And so from the time that the First Amendment was ratified in 1791, all the way until 1947, that's what the First Amendment meant. But in 1947, the U.S. Supreme Court said, we need to change this a little bit. They said Jefferson used separation of church and state to protect the free exercise of religion. We think he applied it to the wrong clause. Instead of keeping the government out, we need to apply separation of church and state to government expressions. And so what we need to do now is stop religious activities in public. So they came up with what's called the establishment test in 1947. Then we get to a number of cases coming to the court that deal with religious expression. And in those cases at the court said, you know, we've got so many cases, we better erect a new standard so you understand what's constitutional religion. And the case 1971 called Lemon versus Kurtzman, they came out with a three-pronged test. It's called the Lemon test because it came out of the case Lemon versus Kurtzman. It says, if you want a religious activity to be constitutional, here's what you have to do. They said the only way that a public religious expression is going to be constitutional is if the primary purpose of that public religious expression is secular. Now, wait a minute. That's completely oxymoronic. There's no way you can prove that the primary purpose of prayer is secular. There's no way you can prove the primary purpose of the display of the nativity scene is secular. There's no way you can prove that the primary purpose of saying under God in the pledge is secular. You can't do it. And so now we lose every case on religious expression because of the Lemon test, which says unless religion has a secular primary purpose, you can't do it. Well, that was 1971. So then we move along to 1985, and in the case of 1985, the court came up with a new test for the First Amendment. It's called the endorsement test. And they said, you know, if it looks like the government is even friendly to religion, that's unconstitutional. And so now they have to appear to be hostile. So anytime religion pops up, they go, oh no, we can't do that. And that's why you can't have a student individually say something religious at a graduation. Wow. That's why you can't have a city councilman say something religious to open a city council, because that might look like government's being friendly to religion. That's the endorsement test. And the final and the most absurd test was given in 1992, and the Supreme Court calls it the outsider test. And the outsider test says, you know, if you're part of a religious minority, like if you're an atheist, only 6% of America doesn't believe in God, so if you're in that religious minority, and you see somebody else doing a religious activity in the majority that makes you feel like an outsider, we'll make them all stop so that you won't feel like an outsider. So as you look across the cases, we have several dozen cases on the Ten Commandments in America, Ten Commandments displays. The people who sued in those cases, you'll find the same phrase in every one of them. They said, you know, I was walking down the sidewalk and I looked over at the Capitol and I saw that monument of the Ten Commandments, and when I saw that I felt like an outsider in my own nation. And so the court stepped in and say, all right, take out the Ten Commandments. You can't feel it. Well, how about the 94% who don't feel like outsiders? And by the way, if the 94% say, I feel like an outsider when it's gone, they say, oh, you're in the majority, you don't count. This only works if you're in a religious minority. So now separation of church and state means that it has to be secular. Government can't appear to be friendly toward a religion. And if religious expression of somebody individually makes you feel uncomfortable, we'll make them all stop. That's completely reversed from the original separation that meant government, don't stop a religious expression. It's not your business to tell us what religious expressions are supposed to occur. What a reversal of separation of church and state just in the last 50 years.
For more information on the American Heritage Series, or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com. Through the American Heritage Series, renowned historian David Barton communicates our nation's forgotten, godly foundation.
Anybody remember the year when we found like outside of the Western?
separation of church and state is a phrase that we've had in American history for 400 years. But in the last 50 years, the court has interpreted it in such a way that it now causes the First Amendment to violate itself, amazingly. We have two clauses to the First Amendment. One guarantees the free exercise of religion so that we can freely express our religious faith. And the second prohibits the establishment of a national church. Well, the court now says, you know, if you exercise your religious faith, if you pray at a graduation, if you pray at a football game, if you pray at a city council meeting, you're unconstitutionally establishing religion. So what we've got now is if you do part of the First Amendment, you're violating the other part of the First Amendment. That is a really wacky interpretation.
And when did that change?
Well, it changed in 1947 when the Supreme Court decided that instead of using the language of the First Amendment, they're going to use the phrase separation of church and state to interpret the First Amendment. So that became the language of the First Amendment in their opinion, which is not necessarily bad. I mean, we use phrases to interpret constitutional clauses. But what they did, the phrase that had been given specifically to say the free exercise clause is not to be touched by government. In other words, there's separation of church and state, and that will keep the government from stopping your free exercise of religion. 1947, the court says, we think separation of church and state goes better with the establishment clause. In other words, what we're going to tell you is that because of separation of church and state, you can't have the free exercise of religion in a public arena. Now, you can at home, you can at church, you can do free exercise of religion all day long if it's private, but don't try to get public with this. If your free exercise of religion gets public, then you've violated the separation of church and state.
For just short of 2 centuries, the First Amendment had prohibited the federal government from halting public religious exercises. But now, somehow, the First Amendment means just the opposite. All because the court took an 8-word phrase from a private letter and twisted and completely reversed its meaning, and then made that phrase a replacement for the clear wording of the Constitution. That 1962 case redefined the First Amendment, and it's notable for other reasons as well, particularly for its use, or lack thereof, of precedents. Recall that when the 1892 Supreme Court unanimously ruled that Christian principles must remain the basis of American laws and institutions, it had offered nearly 80 precedents as a basis for that decision. The 1962 case was just the opposite, providing virtually no precedents to support its removal of voluntary school prayer. The justices on the court were simply ready to move America in a new direction. So in essence, they simply announced, we'll not have voluntary prayer in schools anymore. We now think that that violates the Constitution. Within 12 months of that original decision and 2 additional cases, the court reaffirmed its removal of voluntary prayer and then broadened its prohibition to include Bible reading at school. This was an even more radical reversal than the removal of voluntary prayer.
How do they get by with chaplains that pray before sessions of Congress, before senatorial, I mean, how does that work?
It's infuriating.
What happens is the very guys who wrote the Constitution, followed by the guys who wrote the First Amendment, are the guys who said, oh, we need to pay for religion. Religious expression is so important. Free exercise of religion is so important. We're going to put federal funds into making sure it occurs. So here they are saying, we're going to fund a House and a Senate chaplain. And by the way, those House and Senate chaplains were funded not to open every session of Congress with prayer. That was only half their duties. The descriptions of chaplains at that point had dual duties. One is they opened the House and the Senate with prayer on a daily basis, which they still do today. The second part of their original responsibilities were they were supposed to preach divine service, or Sunday sermons, every Sunday at the U.S. Capitol. So what we did was we hired chaplains to preach at the Capitol of the United States. We're preaching at the Capitol. What about separation of church and state? Exactly. Separation of church and state is to guarantee that you can have those public religious expressions. The U.S. Congress, same guys who wrote the Constitution and First Amendment, put money into paying chaplains not only to pray for them when they open, but also to preach sermons to them every Sunday in government buildings. Now, that's original intent. That's what was designed. That tells you what separation of church and state meant. And by the way, the American that's credited with giving us that phrase, separation of church and state, in the constitutional era is President Thomas Jefferson. So President Thomas Jefferson, responding to a letter that he'd received from a group of Baptists saying, we're concerned that the government might stop our religious activities, he said, no, it's not going to happen. Separation of church and state, they're not going to stop your activities. He wrote that letter on Friday. January the 1st, 1802. That's where you find the separation of church and state phrase. Now, and by the way, that original letter is in the possession of the U.S. government. It's at the Library of Congress. And Jefferson, when he wrote that letter, there's a lengthy section where he took that little quill pen, all that ink, he wiped out a whole bunch of lines, just completely scribbled through them so you couldn't read what was there. So what's wiped out and what's replaced with that simple little phrase reasserts what he was saying. So Jefferson wrote that letter on Friday, January the 1st, 1802. On Sunday, January the 3rd, 1802, Thomas Jefferson went to the U.S. Capitol to church at the U.S. Capitol to hear his friend, the Reverend John Leland, preach the service at the U.S. Capitol. So what you got is on Friday, he writes separation church and state, and on Sunday, he's in church at the U.S. Capitol. Doesn't he understand his letter? Yes, he understands it. His letter says the government's not going to stop religious activities. So this thing about paid chaplains, we've had that since the very beginning, and that was part of the proof that separation of church and state was to keep the government from stopping those activities.
In modern politics, the term separation of church and state is most commonly used to ban acts of faith in the public arena. But a closer look into history reveals the intentions of this phrase to be just the opposite. How then has our history been redefined and rewritten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
Military chaplains have been the subject of a lot of attention recently. There have been a number of instances. I speak at a lot of military bases all over the world, and I've had for years chaplains coming up to me and saying, you know, we are now required to write our prayers out before we pray them. We have to turn them in advance, and we have to let the JAG attorneys go over them and edit our prayers before we pray them. Going, whoa, time out. That is certainly not the business of government to get into what you're praying and what you're saying. But this has been going on for years. It's been an issue in Congress, a lot of legislation trying to solve this issue. We actually have had chaplains who have been disciplined and demoted for using the wrong words when they prayed their prayers. Now, we have all sorts of faiths in the military chaplain corps. We have Muslims, we have Buddhists, we have Wiccans, we have Christians, we have Jews. It's not the business of government to tell any one of them how to pray. I may disagree with some of their prayers, that's fine. It's not my business to tell you how to pray, and it's sure not the government's business. But this has become a real issue in the military, and it's been a real object, and we have a lot of guys in Congress who not only are military, but they're very committed to religious liberties, and they understand original intent. And these are the guys that have been out there fighting and whacking away and pushing back the bureaucrats, pushing back the ACLUs, pushing back the seculars, saying, look, you don't have a right to tell us what to say when we pray, and you don't even have a right to tell us if we can or can't pray.
Right.
And that's an issue. But see, under the new separation of church and state as opposed to the original, the new has given them all the club they need to go in and beat up people. Matter of fact, we have cases that have gone to the U.S. Supreme Court over the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church and whether they can be pro-life. They're saying that's a violation of separation of church and state. It's not a violation of separation of church and state for a church to take a position that the Bible takes a position of. But people say, yeah, but when you talk about the Bible being pro-life, that's a political position. You violate separation of church and state. Well, even if that were true, there's a free speech clause in the Constitution. So what's happened is the separation of church and state phrase has trumped the free speech phrase. So if you exercise free speech as a religious individual in a public setting, if I were at school and exercised my free speech and said something religious, let's say your free speech doesn't count because separation of church and state.
When the court banned Bible reading from schools in 1963, on what possible grounds did it justify its decision? If you want to see why the court did what it did, simply read the case for yourself. You can find it online, or you can go to a local law library and read it. And if you do, you'll see that in reaching its decision, the lower court had relied on the testimony of a psychologist who explained the danger of reading the Bible in schools. The Supreme Court then repeated that finding, reporting, if portions of the New Testament were read without explanation, they could be and had been psychologically harmful to the child. That decision to remove the Bible from schools, just like the decision to ban voluntary prayer, was a reversal of all previous practice and rulings by the court on that issue. The court was simply announcing yet another new policy. In essence, it was just saying the majority of the 9 of us on the court don't want the Bible in schools anymore. For example, in 1967, a federal court declared a 4-line nursery rhyme used by a K-5 kindergarten class to be unconstitutional. The court acknowledged that the word God did not appear anywhere in the nursery rhyme, yet the rhyme was still unconstitutional. Apparently, if someone were to hear the rhyme, he might think that it was talking about God, and that would be unconstitutional. This trend of hostility toward religious expressions continued in case after case, year after year. In fact, by 1980, the Supreme Court even addressed whether students could continue voluntarily to see the 10 Commandments while at school. The court acknowledged that the 10 Commandments in question were passive displays, just one of many pictures at school. That is, a student might see hanging on the wall a picture of George Washington, or a field of flowers, or a lighthouse on a seashore, or student artwork, or the 10 Commandments, or whatever. In fact, here is an original copy of the 10 Commandments that led to the Supreme Court case. They were not part of any curriculum. They passively hung on the wall. And like any other picture, a student could look at them if he wanted to, and if he didn't, he just walked on by. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court ruled that allowing students even voluntarily to see a copy of the 10 Commandments at school was unconstitutional. The 10 Commandments had to come down off the walls. Notice the court's explanation. If the posted copies of the 10 Commandments are to have any effect at all, it will be to induce the school children to read, meditate upon, perhaps to venerate and obey the commandments. This is not a permissible state objective. What a statement. We can't let students see the 10 Commandments. If they saw them, they might read them. And if they read them, they might respect them. They might even obey them. You know, things like don't steal and don't kill. That would be unconstitutional.
What I loved is how you even got into all this, Dave. You had looked up all the stats, the SAT scores, and the prayers in school. It was just every day started out with prayer in school.
That's right.
And it was that simple prayer. And then after that, can you talk about that for a second?
What happened was you have the first public school law passed in America in 1647. And from 1647 for over 3 centuries, we had prayer in school, a regular part of what we did. But in 1962, the U.S. Supreme Court for the first time said, time to do something different. You know, since we reversed the meaning of separation of church and state, that now means you can't have prayer at school anymore. Now, I've seen a lot of critics say, well, it's a good thing the court got involved because those poor kids were being forced to pray against their will. It's absolute nonsense. The court itself said that that prayer that they struck down was voluntary and it was non-denominational. Matter of fact, that prayer was that there were 4 major religious groups that came together and said, you know, we all agree on God. And so you had the Orthodox Church, you had the Catholic, you had the Jewish, and you had the Protestants got together and came up with a 22-word prayer. And if you want to say it, fine. It's just a simple acknowledgement. It said, Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee. We beg Thy blessings on us, our parents, our teachers, our country. Simple. Bland. Who's going to get offended at that? Well, somebody got offended. They weren't being forced to pray. Nobody was being forced to pray. The court said it is voluntary. It's non-denominational. Now, we hear from civil libertarians that the court stopped that coercive prayer. That's nonsense. If you look at every prayer decision the court has delivered since then, there's never been a case of coercion. It's always voluntary. As a matter of fact, in the 1985 case, Wallace versus Jaffrey, the court used that 62 case to say, oh, by the way, you can't even have silent prayer. You go, wait a minute. And how do they know if I'm praying silently anyway? You know, I've always wondered what the enforcement mechanism is. But the court, this is such nonsense that they're saying it's even unconstitutional for you to voluntarily pray silently. Now, there's no coercion in silent prayer. Nobody can make you pray silently. So we have all these cases. We have the case out of Duncanville schools where you had 10 girls on the basketball team. They were all Christians. They wanted to pray. They got together and prayed. The court said, even though all of you want to pray, you can't do it. It's unconstitutional to have prayer at schools. I mean, these are people desiring to pray. And now you got the court saying, oh no, all school prayer. So that's what happened in 62, 63, was the beginning of the end of any kind of prayer in schools. Even if it's voluntary, even if 100% of the people want it, you can't do it.
John Adams unequivocally declared, if thou shalt not covet and thou shalt not steal were not commandments of heaven,
They must be made inviolable precepts in every society before it can be civilized or made free. This was the clear declaration of John Adams. And by the way, I think he qualifies as an expert on the First Amendment. After all, he personally oversaw its framing in the U.S. Senate, and his signature is one of only two that appears at the bottom of the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. And he forcefully asserts that the Ten Commandments must be fundamental precepts of our civil society. Founding Father James Wilson also affirmed the importance of divine laws such as the Ten Commandments. James Wilson was the distinguished founding father who served many years in Independence Hall, signing both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, one of only 6 founders to sign both documents. He was then appointed by President George Washington as an original justice on the U.S. Supreme Court, where he served in the court for its first 9 years, including when it met here in this room next door to Independence Hall. Significantly, James Wilson was the founder of the first organized legal training in America. In fact, these law books contain the lectures he delivered to law students here in Philadelphia while simultaneously serving here as a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. These are really the first American law school textbooks. James Wilson, having helped write the Constitution and then taught students about it, would certainly know what is and is not constitutional. So did he think that divine laws such as the Ten Commandments, must be kept out of public view? Here's what he clearly explained to students. Human law must rest its authority ultimately upon the authority of that law which is divine. Far from being rivals or enemies, religion and law are twin sisters, friends, and mutual assistance. James Wilson certainly did not believe that the Ten Commandments or divine law should be kept from public view. And many other founders made similarly explicit statements. Furthermore, early courts issued literally dozens of rulings citing from the Ten Commandments as a legal authority on numbers of diverse issues. In fact, so clear was the civil recognition of America's reliance on the Ten Commandments that for decades, one was more likely to find a copy of the Ten Commandments hanging in a government building than in a religious one. Yet despite this lengthy history of reliance on the Ten Commandments, the court suddenly held that students could no longer see the teachings that are the basis of our laws.
In modern politics, the term separation of church and state is most commonly used to ban acts of faith in the public arena. But a closer look into history reveals the intentions of this phrase to be just the opposite. How then has our history been redefined and rewritten? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
The phrase separation of church and state, where did that come from?
The first time in human history, you got to go back into England in the 1500s. The theologian Richard Hooker was the one who used the phrase. He's one of the guys associated with the Reformation. And the Reformation, you've got a lot of the reformers teaching the concept of separation of church and state. They're teaching, look, we got to get the two institutions apart. This thing of having the church and state run each other, of having the church with the sword, and of having the state decide what religious activities, not to be.
Okay.
So they were advocating institutional separation, but then Richard Hooker, theologian, is the first one who used the phrase separation of church and state.
So since that time, the original phrase was used in what year?
The original phrase was used back in the 1500s in England.
Okay, from 1530 to 1947, it was consistent in its meaning?
Consistent in its meaning.
And then it changed in 1947.
We have a completely new meaning, and today Americans think that the current meaning is what it's always been.
Okay,
What we
so that
have.
just means that we just have people in the wrong places. That the government is filled with misinformed people that we have to change.
Well, this is one of the things that we continue to reteach this myth that goes again and again. It's in our textbooks.
Yeah.
We hear it every time a decision comes down from the Supreme Court, because the court tells us that the founding fathers wanted separation of church and state, and therefore you can't have this religious activity. We hear from the court. It's repeated when the press repeats the decisions of the court. You have a lot of secularists who repeat it on a regular basis, and you have very few Americans who know their own history. Quite frankly, we just don't know our own writings.
At the same time they're making those decisions, Congress and Senate have paid chaplains
That's right.
on staff right now.
What has happened, the way the court handles this dichotomy, because on the one hand you're saying it's unconstitutional to have these activities, but on the other hand you're saying, wait a minute, these activities were put in by the guys who did the Constitution, so how can it be unconstitutional? So what they've come up with is a historical exclusion. It's what they call ceremonial deism. Ceremonial deism says, in God we trust. We've had that on coins since back in the Civil War. In God we trust actually goes back to the national anthem, the fourth stanza of the national anthem back in 1813, 1814. Francis Scott Key wrote that. We've had that in America for 200 years. So how are we going to say that we can strike it down? Oh, I know. Here's what we'll say. We'll say nobody really believes it anymore. It's ceremonial deism, and therefore you can leave it in the coins, you can leave it on the money, because it doesn't mean anything to most people. Oh, I sure appreciate them telling me what I do and don't believe it, but that's how they excuse it. They say ceremonial deism. So things like that, other little phrases that may appear with God in it, they say, nobody really believes that. It's not theological. It's been there for a long time. It's just historical. That's what they do with chaplains. They say, chaplains have been there since the beginning. It's one of those historical traditions that's out there. It doesn't really bother people. People really don't listen to the prayers anyway. So if you want to have a chaplain, it's nonsense the way that they have to come up with exceptions to justify their lunacy in having flipped the First Amendment on its head.
Returning to the 1962 decision that initiated the official hostility toward public religious expressions, the entire controversy had begun over a 22-word voluntary prayer that the court struck down in the Engel Vital case. That little prayer, which led to the end of all school prayer and so many other public religious expressions, had simply stated, Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. That little voluntary prayer, which only acknowledged God and didn't even mention the word Jesus, was so bland that 8 years later it was described by a court as a, quote, to whom it may concern prayer. Now that's bland. That prayer acknowledged God only once, the same number of times that God is acknowledged in the Pledge of Allegiance, and only 1/4 the number of times He's acknowledged in the Declaration of Independence. Yet somehow, that single voluntary acknowledgement was unconstitutional. Since this prayer merely acknowledged God, the court even went so far as to investigate what percentage of the nation at that time did believe in God. The court reported that only 3% professed no belief in religion, no belief in God. Significantly, 97% of the nation did believe. That 22-word prayer was consistent with the beliefs of nearly all the nation. Yet the court said that it was unconstitutional for students even voluntarily to say what almost the entire nation believed. This was another first by the court, in addition to 1, having ignored the actual wording of the Constitution, 2, having set aside precedent, and 3, then having elevated an 8-word phrase from a private letter above the Constitution itself. The court, having no constitutional basis and nothing more than its own preference, now, 4, sided with the 3% against the 97%. This was the first time in America's history that 3% had become the majority. This decision initiated the current policy whereby the philosophy of the small dissident group, that is the 3%, becomes the standard by which the rest of the nation, that is the 97%, must conduct its public affairs.
Religious individuals find themselves with less constitutional protection than secular individuals. Secular individuals have the right of free speech, and the court has now ruled that secular faith is a religious faith, guaranteed protection under the religion clauses. Now, if secularism, which is anti-religion, is a religion, then you've now said that anti-religion is a religion, and if you protect anti-religion under religion, you have just shot religion. There is no religious protection. And we have a number of rulings where the court has ruled that atheism is a religion. They've ruled that secular humanism, these are all religions without God. So how can you extend religious expressions, religious protections to people who don't have religious faith? That's where the court has taken us. And that's why now traditional religious people find themselves on the wrong end of nearly every issue. When it comes to where people are, it's real simple. We've had for years a controversy over keeping under God in the pledge. 90% of the people wanted the pledge. For decades, the court has said you can't have prayer schools. For decades, the numbers have been rising. There's now over 80% of the nation that wants prayer in schools. And by the way, find me anything else that 80% of the nation agrees on. You can't. And so what happens is we hear from civil libertarians and critics that school prayer is divisive. No, the absence of school prayer is divisive. You got 80% of the nation that wants voluntary prayer to be available, that if you want to pray, you can pray. Well, it's the 20% that's running the 80%. It's the 10% that's running the 90%. displays of the Ten Commandments that consistently runs between 70 and 80% of the nation wants public displays of the Ten Commandments. They don't win. It's the 20% that win because they say we feel like outsiders when we see things like don't steal and don't kill. This is really nonsense. And original intent is so clear because now we can't have the Bible in schools, but founding fathers put the Bible in schools. And this is the guy who did the First Amendment language. Now I would think the guy who wrote the First Amendment language knows its intent. And here it says you can't let the Bible ever get pushed back to the classrooms in public schools. It's got to be our #1 textbook. This is the guy, Benjamin Rush, is called the father of public schools under the Constitution. He has a lengthy piece in here giving a dozen reasons we'll never take the Bible out of public schools. Well, now we take it out because we say the founding fathers didn't want it. See, this is what happens when you don't know your history. It gets turned on its head, our policies get totally reversed, and that's been the case with separation of church and state.
For more information on the American Heritage Series, or to find books and other resources, visit wallbuilders.com.
Yeah.
Through the American...
Good morning. What, it got changed to what you thought it was?
I already knew all that.
You're as bad as Crouch. That boy didn't learn anything in history. He went to school. You ever notice that? He don't move nothing. Wait a second, you're telling me the Bible's Word of God? I'm not, that's exactly. I think he must be playing a role. A non-smart person's role to make.
He doesn't want the
Sad.
viewer to feel
Part of the-
isolated or alone in their ignorance. I don't know.
Yeah.
He wants everyone to have a safe space.
Would you take him home and teach him something? Anybody else, anything you want to? Anybody else that found something new today that you didn't know?
Basically how recent, within just lifespans, hundreds of years, even into 1500s when it's first mentioned, that in a matter of 60 years, it's completely turned around. I did have kind of somewhat similar to the proper meaning of separation of church and state. They didn't really go so far.
Okay.
But the way it's received now and the way that they've handled it so that it becomes an offensive weapon for them, as opposed to this was created to be offensive, and defensive weapon for Christians. For those that follow, God, the government stay out or, telling us to organize. They can't tell us what to do, basically. It's just amazing how they can take that and use it as an angle to totally wipe away one thing that makes Christians grow. We want to go, we want to tell, it's our first commandment. Jesus is to go and tell the world. And their tactic right now is preventing us from being able to go do our first commandment.
Well, it's intended to, unfortunately, it's when it should not be.
That's the second reason.
As Christians, we should still be
Yeah, that's
doing, having the faith. Go ahead and do it anyhow. Pay the price. That's what they're doing over in Vietnam, they're doing in China, that's what they're doing in all the other places. And the gospel is spreading like wildfire. Because the heavier the persecution, the more the gospel spreads. So, that's what we should. Okay, here's your test. Everybody take out your smartphones. I'm serious. Google. Who was the administration in 1947? Okay, that's it. Go. find out who was the,
Very true.
Truman. He's Democrat, right?
Yes.
Yes.
That says it all right there. When was the Supreme Court put in? Did Truman put anybody on the Supreme Court?
Three, probably at least. Probably took the numbers and tilted it. Because the majority of the time, the Supreme Court has always been on conservative lean. There was a period in the 50s and 60s where it tilted, and the liberal stance had control of the Supreme Court.
I didn't even know there was liberals back then.
During his 2 terms, he appointed 4 members to the U.S. Supreme Court.
And when is his first term? When was his term? When was his first term? 40 through 48?
Probably.
Truman is Lucifer's child. That's it. What else can you say? Right? Here's my thing. Why didn't they make the courts go back to the previous? Because all courts, but Supreme Court especially, is supposed to, before they cast their verdict, is supposed to go back to prior cases. And all the prior cases, before that, they're making their ruling and how they were ruled before. So why wasn't that done in 1947? Because if it had been done, there was 4 different cases of church and separation that he talked about that was upheld by the Supreme Courts prior to that. So, why aren't we making our Supreme Courts go back and looking at our legislature?
Lobbies there to say, hey, you go back and look at this. That was wrong.
Since Antonio Scalia died, I don't think we got any conservative on with enough brass to try to take it off. All right, anything else?
He was elected in 45, not really elected, but because of,
He took over,
he
finished
took
term.
over from Roosevelt. So he was really only in office less than 2 years before all that happened.
But he was re-elected.
He was reelected.
He finished the term of Roosevelt and then elected. So he was in for 6 years.
Okay. Anybody else got anything that interesting that you got out of it? Today was a little bit more interesting. Hopefully it will continue down the road. We should wonder what has to go back on computers.
He's just having those basic information so it sticks.
That's what it is. That's what it is.
Repetition helps.
All right, well, if nobody's got anything, then you get to be better today.
Yay. Thank you for the study, and thank you for what we're learning, help us to be able to use it in conversation to defend what's right and what's true and your values and biblical values. Just pray that you continue to bless our church and use all of us here, and just pray that we be a light in the world and chances to share Christ with those that are around us. We love you, and just ask for a safe trip home for everybody. In Jesus' name, amen.
I know what I was going to say, what good are those animals that they keep recording of all their, if nobody will read them? Because now the only ones that read are the ones that do the way that they want, they don't go back to them.